Today, Pope Francis added his voice to those calling for an end to the violence in Venezuela. During his weekly audience at the Vatican, he called for dialogue after the recent clashes that have left at least 13 people dead. Anti-government protesters are on the streets demonstrating against President Maduro's handling of the economy, and levels of violence have reached record highs. For more, I spoke a short time ago with Peter Schechter, director of the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center. How does this end? We've had, 2 weeks of violence now, 13 dead, some of the most violent protests in the last decade in Venezuela. What happens next?
Well, it's not going to end as quickly as it did in the Ukraine, unfortunately. It's going to go on. There are protests all around the country, but they're not massive protests either. There were a couple of very large protests. But I think the government is very entrenched. The situation in Venezuela is catastrophic economically, scarcity everywhere. People have to shop in multiple places to find what they have to eat, and inflation's at 56%. So this can't go on, but the exit strategy is really pretty unclear.
So who is it that's out on the streets at the moment? Do we have a broad spectrum of Venezuelan society opposed to the government because of these economic conditions, or are these the people who've always been opposed to the Chavez movement?
No, I think the people who have always been opposed to the Chavez movement are, of course, there, but there are also increasing numbers of Venezuelans who are beginning to see that the highest criminality rate in the world, the most disastrous situation economically, is not the fault of everybody but the government, as the government would like people to believe, but rather it's the fault of the government who can't manage the situation. Under Chavez, the situation barely proceeded.
But at what point do you get a kind of tipping point where enough Venezuelans are fed up with the government that actually a government that was popularly elected and had that election result reinforced in local elections in December actually goes? I mean, we're quite away from that, aren't we?
I don't think we're there yet, certainly. I mean, I think that there is room for negotiation, and the government seems to be making signs that they're looking for some types of negotiation. Right now, their invitation to negotiations is something akin to, I hate you, I despise you, but come sit with me. And basically, it's an invitation to come listen to me. But I think it's possible that if things continue, that we might get an actual dialogue. And I think a dialogue is possible if, for example, you were mentioning Pope Francis. I think the Church has a role to play here.
OK, if we were looking beyond Pope Francis to other players in the region, whether it's in Latin America or perhaps in North America, the kind of leverage that the United States may or may not have, who is there that can be the party that mediates this crisis in Venezuela?
Well, certainly the opposition has actually offered the Church. I mean, the Church as a mediator has a long history in Latin America, in Brazil, in Argentina, between Chile and Argentina. I mean, the Church has a long role as a mediator. And the opposition has actually suggested, why don't we bring the Church in as a mediator and have a third party there with an agenda to begin a dialogue between us. Right now, the government wants to invite people to a meeting so they can show that they've had a meeting. But they don't have an agenda, they don't have a dialogue, and they certainly don't have a third party.
OK, meanwhile, those protests, of course, are continuing. Thanks very much for coming, Peter Schechter.